And today we'll bring in our partners at Fidelity National Title, Kyle and David. Today we'll be talking about good and bad preliminary reports. What you'll need to see, what you need to understand, what's good and bad about them, and if you should move forward with the transaction or not. This will be rather technical. If you have questions, let us know. We'll be happy to answer.
Hi, I'm David Glansrock.
And I'm Kyle Anderson.
And we're with Fidelity National Title here in Orange County. Okay, so one of the questions that we get asked is, what is title insurance? Because it shows up as a line item on your closing statement. Now, title insurance is actually an insurance policy that a title company issues to a buyer, seller, lender, depending upon if it's a purchase or a refinance. And what that title insurance policy does is it insures the property against any previous encumbrances. So for example, if you were to purchase a home and someone were to come back and say, no, I own a partial interest from 1972, the title insurance company actually ensures that it would get paid out to that person that's claiming interest in the property. So when you buy a property or you refinance a property, you own it free and clear of any encumbrances and are insured against anyone coming out and saying, hey, I should have been paid, we have an outstanding debt against this property.
Okay, so what we have right here is a preliminary report. Now, why these are important and what does a title company do when we issue a preliminary report? Well, there's three major things that we want to look at. We want to look at taxes, we want to look at any liens or encumbrances, and we also want to see how the property is vested.
Okay, so the first thing that you're going to see on a preliminary title report is what we call the vesting. Now, the vesting is basically how the property is owned. Who owns the property, whether it's an individual, a married couple, a corporation, an LLC, a trust, or one of 100 different variations. And that tells us who has the authority to sell the property. Now, one of the things that might not necessarily be a pleasant aspect of title is something we call rights of survivorship. And what that means is if one of the owners were to pass away, it can clearly be spelled out in the vesting on the title report who has the authority to sell that property in the unfortunate circumstance if the owner was to pass away. Now, in some of those cases, it might mean that the heir can immediately sell the property if it's in a trust and the trust is current and you have all the documentation, or if there is no rights of survivorship listed in the vesting, you would have to go to probate, and that's something to consider when you take title on a property.
Alright, so the next items up on the preliminary title report are going to be the exceptions. And we're just going to go down the list of exceptions. Starting at the top, you're going to have taxes, whether they're open, if they're delinquent, have they been paid, followed by some easements, utilities, are they part of an HOA? Things to be aware of for a buyer especially, right, David?
Yeah, I think, what you're going to see in the easements, especially if you have a homeowners association or part of a condo complex or a townhome complex, is you're going to see easements such as utility easements, common area maintenance, things like that are going to be listed in the after the property taxes in the title report.
Kind of working down the list after that, we're going to see, things to be completely aware of. Judgments are a big one. Abstracts of judgments. Are they bad? Maybe, maybe not. Something to be aware of. It could be something as simple as a common name.
Yeah, and so what we look at is when we first get a preliminary title report, it's called a preliminary title report for a reason. Yeah. It's preliminary.
Yeah.
And so the way some of the government systems work is they look at names. They're not looking at property addresses. So if you have a very common name,
John Smith,
and there's a John Smith in Nebraska that might owe child support or has a judgment for spousal support or some kind of bankruptcy filing or something like that.
Well, that's going to tick the system on our John Smith, right, for this title report?
It is. And so before the alarms are sounded by your realtor, before you panic and say, hey, I'm not even married and I don't have a kid, What we need a document called the Statement of Information. And the Statement of Information is something that's required for every real estate transaction.
Right.
It's required for the buyer, it's required for the seller, and it's required if you refinance a property. And what the Statement of Information does is it allows us as a title company to verify and validate that the John Smith whose lien that belongs to is the John Smith that owns our particular subject property.
It's not you.
And within 20 or 30 minutes of receiving that back, we actually can remove anything that doesn't belong to our specific seller. Now, what's really important is if you're getting a preliminary report and you're buying a property and you see all kinds of abstract judgments and notices of default,
don't freak out,
and child support, things like that, that's not really a concern, because that's going to be handled by the title and escrow company before you're allowed to purchase that property. Because I can tell you this, there is not a title company in the world that will allow a property to close without clear title.
No. Nope. So after all of these exceptions, what you're going to want to actually look at is the deeds of trust. How many are there? Is it a home equity line of credit? We spell them out to you near the end of the exceptions list, right, David?
Yeah, and so one of the things that is asked a lot is a deed of trust. That's a loan. That's your loan on the property.
Right.
And there can be a little bit of confusion, because what if your property is held in a trust and you have 3 deeds of trust? They're not the same thing. A trust is an instrument in which you plan your survivorship. A deed of trust is actually the loan that you would have with your bank. Now, one of the things that's very important to keep an eye on is that home equity lines of credit. If you're a seller and you have a home equity line of credit, that is a deed of trust, and that will be listed here at the last part of the exceptions. Now, the last thing we're actually going to have, and we'll put up an example of this, is what other information does the title company itself require? Now, we already told you that every transaction is going to require a statement of information, and that statement of information is going to be for all parties involved in the transaction.
So what about, what if there's no open deeds of trust? What are they going to have to do there?
Well, so in many cases, and it's kind of the luck of the draw, because our goal is to mitigate risk on everyone's part.
Right.
So in some situations, you might actually have to have your escrow company fill out an extra form, which is called a no deed of trust affidavit. Mm-hmm. Basically, the seller is stating, hey, we didn't find any open loans on the property, and we're attesting to that fact that there are no open loans on the property. Now, one of the things that's very important is the requirements section, and that comes after all the exceptions that you're going to see. Now, what the requirements section is it's going to list what additional information we need as a title company to be able to close the loan. Now, this is for sellers only. This isn't a buyer requirement. This is only for sellers. And of course, it's going to say the statement of information, and that's going to be, if your property's in a trust, it's going to be for everybody that's listed on that trust. If your property's in a corporation, it's going to be for all of the public officers of that corporation. It also might ask for additional information on the trust. In this particular situation, this property is vested in a corporation, so the title company is going to need to review the corporate papers. If the property is vested in a trust, we would need either the trust certificate or a complete copy of the trust.
So just to sum it up, at the end of all the exceptions, go to the requirements, check it out. Don't let all the exceptions scare you. Go to the requirements and see what you have to do. And you know what? Worst comes to worst, you don't know what's going on, call one of us.
Well, and that's one of the great things, that if you choose to work with us at Fidelity, we're actually going to review every single prelim that we get. We call it our priority prelim.
Right.
And what that's going to do is, we're not going to point out things like easements or stuff like that, but we're going to point out the stuff that's important to the seller, the escrow officer, and to the realtor.
Right.
So those are going to be things like, are property taxes current? Are there any judgments or additional encumbrances on the properties, judgments, liens, back taxes, things like that? How is the property vested? How many open deeds of trust or loans you have? And what additional paperwork do we need to have? It's just an extra set of eyes. We want to make sure that the escrow process goes as quickly and smoothly as possible for you, and we can really help do that by reviewing the prelim for you ahead of time.
Thanks, Kyle and David, for informing us about prelim. For more information, call me, call them, let us know. Have a good day.